On July 8, 1968, one day after Bumpy Johnson was buried, a rumor began spreading quietly through Harlem. Bumpy Johnson, the most powerful black crime boss in New York history, had not died broke. The official story said he left almost nothing. A modest apartment. A regular car. A bank account with less than $50,000. But the rumor said something else. It said Bumpy Johnson had hidden $50 million in cash somewhere in Harlem. And if that rumor was true, it meant one thing: the FBI had missed the largest hidden fortune in American criminal history. For the next 10 years, federal agents would search Harlem building by building, warrant by warrant, chasing a fortune that never showed up in any bank, any ledger, or any safe. What they didn't know was this: they would walk into the exact location where the money was hidden. Tear the place apart. And still leave empty-handed. Because the money wasn't hidden like money. It was hidden like something else. By the summer of 1968, Harlem was unstable. Bumpy Johnson had ruled its underworld for more than 30 years. He survived the Italian Mafia. He survived prison. He survived dozens of federal investigations. And then, on July 7, 1968, he collapsed at Wells Restaurant on 148th Street after suffering a heart attack. Bumpy Johnson was dead at 62 years old. Within hours, power shifted. Italian mob figures watched closely. Rival black gangsters like Nicky Barnes started making calls, and law enforcement believed the same thing everyone else believed: if Bumpy Johnson had real money, it would surface now. It didn't. The day after the funeral, one man didn't leave Harlem. Frank Lucas. At the time, Frank was known as Bumpy Johnson's driver and trusted lieutenant. Quiet. Disciplined. Not flashy. That morning, Frank sat alone inside Bumpy Johnson's apartment at 409 Edgecombe Avenue. The place was empty. No guards. No family. No entourage. Frank stayed because he knew something no one else did. 3 months earlier, he and Bumpy Johnson had a conversation, one Frank never forgot. Late at night, just the two of them. Bumpy sat near the window, drinking whiskey, looking out over Harlem. He turned to Frank and said, "Frank, you know what separates a smart gangster from a dead gangster?" Frank shook his head. "What's that, Bumpy?" Bumpy took a sip. "A smart gangster never lets anyone know how much money he really has. Not the government. Not his crew. Not even his family." Frank nodded. "So you hide it?" Bumpy smiled. "I've been hiding it for 30 years. Frank paused. "How much we talking about?" Bumpy looked at him for a long moment. $50 million. All cash. Frank thought he misheard. 50 million. Bumpy leaned back. "And when I die, I'm not telling anyone where it is. If you're smart enough to find it, you deserve it." That was it. No map. No instructions. Just a challenge. Now Bumpy was dead. And Frank Lucas was sitting in his apartment trying to figure out where a 62-year-old gangster could hide $50 million in cash. Frank searched the apartment for hours. Behind paintings. Under floorboards. Inside walls. Ceilings. Closets. Nothing. And that's when Frank realized something important: Bumpy Johnson would never hide money somewhere the police would search first. Not his apartment. Not a bank. Not a safe. Bumpy had spent his entire life staying ahead of law enforcement. Which meant the money had to be somewhere no one would ever think to look. After 6 straight hours tearing apart Bumpy Johnson's apartment at 409 Edgecombe Avenue, Frank Lucas stopped. He sat down on Bumpy's couch, exhausted. If the money had been there, he would have found it. And Frank knew something else. If the police ever raided that apartment, which they absolutely would, they would search it the same way Frank just did. Walls. Floors. Ceilings. Bumpy Johnson was too smart for that. Frank stood up and said it out loud to himself, Bumpy wouldn't hide it here. So Frank stopped searching places. And started searching patterns. Frank had spent years driving Bumpy around Harlem. He knew Bumpy's habits. Bumpy never trusted banks. Never trusted accountants. Never trusted paperwork. Everything Bumpy owned was cash-based and local. Properties. Businesses. Community institutions. And Bumpy always said the same thing, the safest place is where nobody feels threatened. Frank thought about that. If the police thought a place was legitimate, they searched it fast, and carelessly. That meant the money had to be somewhere that felt normal. Frank knew Bumpy Johnson owned property all over Harlem. 17 buildings in total, apartments, warehouses, storefronts. For the next 2 weeks, Frank visited every single one. He checked the basements, attics, storage rooms, boiler rooms. He tore apart walls, lifted floorboards, checked ceilings. Nothing. Not $1. After 2 weeks, Frank was starting to doubt himself. What if Bumpy was lying? But Frank immediately rejected that thought. Bumpy Johnson never lied about money. If Bumpy said there was 50 million, then 50 million existed. Frank just hadn't thought the right way yet. That's when Frank remembered something else Bumpy used to say. Not in a speech, just casually. People always hide things where they think they're safe. That's why they get found. Frank sat in his car on 125th Street, replaying that sentence. Bumpy believed the opposite. He believed the safest place to hide something was where nobody expected danger. Frank said it again, quietly. In plain sight. Frank thought about everything Bumpy owned that people saw every day. Not buildings people broke into. Not apartments police raided. But places that served a purpose. Places people respected. Then it hit him. The funeral home. Bumpy Johnson owned Renaissance Funeral Home on 125th Street. He bought it in 1955. Publicly, Bumpy said he bought it so black families in Harlem wouldn't be exploited by white funeral directors. Everyone respected the place. No one questioned it. And most importantly, no one searched funeral homes. Frank drove there just after midnight. The streets were quiet. He unlocked the door with Bumpy's keys and stepped inside. The place smelled like disinfectant and flowers. Caskets lined the showroom. In the back were the embalming rooms. Frank walked past everything, and headed straight for the freezer. In February 1969, the FBI obtained a limited search warrant for Renaissance Funeral Home. The justification? Possible tax violations and unreported income. Agents entered during business hours. They searched offices, file cabinets, basements, storage rooms. They did not search the freezer. Out of respect. Out of protocol. Out of assumption. McCarthy stood inside the building knowing something was wrong. But he couldn't prove it. They left empty-handed. Frank Lucas heard about the raid within hours. He didn't panic. He didn't move the money. He didn't touch it. Frank understood something the FBI didn't. The moment he moved the cash, it became vulnerable. As long as it stayed frozen, disguised as bodies, it was untouchable. And for the next 4 years, that's exactly what happened. Between 1969 and 1973, the FBI searched multiple Bumpy-owned properties. Storage units. Abandoned buildings. Associates' homes. They never found the money. Meanwhile, Frank quietly began building something else. An empire. Using small amounts of the hidden cash at a time. Never enough to trigger attention. Never enough to leave a trail. That money would fund something far bigger than Bumpy Johnson ever imagined. Frank Lucas made one rule for himself in 1969, he would never take large amounts from the freezer. Never truckloads. Never suitcases. Never anything that could be noticed. Instead, Frank removed money the way a man siphons gasoline, slowly, invisibly. 5,000 here. 10,000 there. Always cash. Always untraceable. That money funded something Frank had been planning long before Bumpy died. Going straight to the source. At the time, Harlem heroin was controlled by Italian Mafia middlemen, corrupt dock workers, street-level distributors. By the time heroin reached Harlem, it was already cut, sometimes 4 or 5 times. Frank hated that system. Not because it was illegal. Because it was inefficient. He once said, everybody had their hand in the bag before it reached the customer. Frank believed Bumpy's money could eliminate all of that. In 1970, Frank Lucas began making trips to Bangkok, Thailand. Officially, he was a businessman. Unofficially, he was meeting with Kun Sa, connected traffickers and independent heroin refiners. Frank didn't use brokers. He didn't use translators. He dealt directly. He offered something unheard of at the time, cash, paid up front. No delays. No middlemen. No cutting corners. Frank used Bumpy's frozen money to finance these trips. Small portions at a time. Always clean. By 1971, Frank had secured a steady supply of near-pure heroin. He branded it Blue Magic. The difference was immediate. Blue Magic was stronger, cheaper, and consistent. Word spread fast. Addicts noticed. Dealers noticed. Rival gangs noticed. Within months, Blue Magic dominated Harlem, and nobody could figure out how Frank Lucas had the capital to pull it off. Dennis McCarthy saw the shift. By 1972, heroin arrests linked to Blue Magic were exploding. McCarthy looked at the numbers. This wasn't street-level money. This was infrastructure money. Planes. Supply chains. International movement. And it traced back to one man. Frank Lucas. But here was the problem. They still couldn't find the source of the money. In November 1972, the FBI returned to Renaissance Funeral Home. This time, the warrant was broader. Drug trafficking. Money laundering. Tax evasion. Agents searched everything again. They opened walls. Pulled up floorboards. Checked storage units. Once again, they did not open the freezer. Once again, they walked out with nothing. McCarthy reportedly said afterward, "If the money's here, it's laughing at us." He wasn't wrong. Frank watched all of this calmly. He didn't move the money. He didn't relocate it. He trusted Bumpy's instinct more than his own fear. And for years, that trust paid off. By 1973, Frank Lucas was earning over $1 million a day at the peak of his operation. All of it seeded by money that technically didn't exist. By 1974, Frank Lucas's operation was too large to stay invisible. Blue Magic had spread beyond Harlem into the Bronx, Brooklyn, New Jersey, Washington, D.C. Street arrests exploded. And every arrest created pressure. Pressure creates mistakes. And mistakes create informants. In early 1974, a mid-level distributor arrested in the Bronx broke. Not because of loyalty. Not because of fear. Because of money. He told detectives one thing: Frank Lucas got money that never touched a bank. That sentence landed with the New York Drug Enforcement Task Force, which by then included the DEA, formed in 1973. Dennis McCarthy was brought back into the picture. This time, it wasn't just about missing money. It was about where the money came from. McCarthy discovered something worse. Several NYPD narcotics officers were on Frank's payroll. They were warning him about raids. Redirecting investigations. Destroying evidence. This explained why Frank stayed ahead. But it also meant one thing. When this broke, it would break hard. In 1974, the NYPD assigned Detective Richie Roberts to investigate police corruption tied to Frank Lucas. Roberts was known for one thing: he couldn't be bought. When Roberts reviewed the evidence, he noticed a strange pattern. Every trail ended the same way. At Frank Lucas. But the money source still made no sense. Roberts asked a simple question during a task force meeting: where did Frank Lucas get his startup money? No one had an answer. Drugs didn't explain it. Street profits didn't explain it. Then McCarthy said something quietly: Bumpy Johnson. That changed everything. Roberts ordered a new approach. Not drug enforcement. Not tax violations. But asset tracing. They mapped every business connected to Bumpy Johnson. Every property. Every utility bill. One building kept reappearing: Renaissance Funeral Home. Roberts didn't care about protocol. He wanted everything examined. Especially the freezer. In late 1974, Roberts pushed for a warrant that would allow agents to inspect all refrigeration units inside the funeral home. The request stalled. Legal departments hesitated. Religious sensitivity. Community backlash. Lack of precedent. By the time approvals came through, Frank already knew. For the first time since 1968, Frank touched the stacks. He didn't empty the freezer. He didn't relocate everything. He removed 3 gurneys. Roughly $24 million. He moved them to a secondary location tied to a trusted associate. The rest stayed frozen. Hidden. Waiting. On January 28, 1975, a federal judge finally signed the warrant Richie Roberts had been pushing for. This one was different. It authorized agents to search every refrigeration unit inside Renaissance Funeral Home, including any area used for storing human remains. No exceptions. No courtesy limits. Dennis McCarthy read the warrant twice. After 7 years of speculation, they were finally going to look where no one wanted to look. At 6:12 a.m. FBI agents, DEA officers, and internal affairs detectives entered the funeral home. The front office was cleared first. Then the embalming rooms. Then the basement. Finally, they reached the freezer. Roberts stood there quietly as an agent pulled the handle. Cold air poured out. Inside were gurneys. Covered in white sheets. Just like before. Roberts nodded. Check them. The first gurney held a body. The second gurney held a body. The third gurney. Money. Frozen stacks of cash, wrapped in plastic. An agent stepped back and said, Jesus Christ. They opened the rest. 3 gurneys still inside. All cash. Approximately $24 million. Not 50. Not everything. But enough. Enough to prove the rumor had been real all along. Dennis McCarthy finally understood. They hadn't been chasing a myth. They had been standing next to it for years. They had searched the building twice. They had walked past the freezer. And Bumpy Johnson's money had been sitting there the entire time. Frank Lucas was arrested later that day at his home in Teaneck, New Jersey. He didn't resist. He didn't run. When agents told him what they found, Frank smiled slightly and said, "You still didn't find all of it." He was right. They never did. Facing 70 years to life, Frank made a decision. He cooperated. He gave up his heroin routes, his corrupt police contacts, his international suppliers. But when it came to Bumpy Johnson's money, Frank stayed silent. Richie Roberts asked him directly, "Where's the rest?" Frank leaned back and said, "Bumpy told me something once. A man who hides his money right never has to explain it. That was the end of the conversation. The $24 million recovered was seized by the federal government. The remaining money? Never recovered. Some believe it was quietly distributed to Harlem families. Others believe it funded Frank's legal defense. Some believe it's still hidden. No proof exists. Only silence. Bumpy Johnson once said, "If you hide something where people are afraid to look, it'll never be found." He died in 1968. But his strategy outlived him. For nearly a decade, the FBI searched Harlem for a fortune that sat untouched in plain sight. Frozen. Ignored. Invisible. Frank Lucas went to prison. Richie Roberts resigned in disgust after exposing corruption. Dennis McCarthy retired knowing the truth had come too late. And Bumpy Johnson? He never spent most of his money. But he proved something no gangster ever had before. That the greatest hiding place isn't underground. It's inside people's assumptions. Bumpy Johnson hid $48 million by turning it into something no one would ever touch. Dead bodies. For 7 years, the FBI searched Harlem. They raided buildings. They interrogated men. They burned money chasing rumors. And they walked past the fortune every single time. Frank Lucas didn't outsmart the FBI with violence. He didn't do it with guns or muscle. He did it by thinking the way Bumpy taught him to think. Hide in plain sight. Stay quiet. Let other people underestimate you. If this story changed the way you think about power, money, or intelligence, hit the like button. If you want more untold stories about American legends, click the subscribe button. Now tell me, was Bumpy Johnson the smartest criminal in American history, or was Frank Lucas smarter for knowing when to stay invisible? Because the FBI searched for 10 years, and still missed what was right in front of them. Leave your comments below. Rest in peace Bumpy Johnson, 1905 to 1968. The man who concealed $48 million in a way no one thought to question. Rest in peace Frank Lucas, 1930 to 2019. The man who uncovered it, leveraged it, and turned it into a legend. A fortune that financed an empire. A lesson that still holds true today. Remain unseen. Move in silence. And never, under any circumstances, wear a chinchilla coat to a boxing match. The end.